We're going to begin our next panel. So this next event is a good one. It's what is religious freedom and what is it not? And the conversation around this will be based around the IRF Summit Charter that can be found online. And so I would like to welcome up Professor Durham, who will be moderating this panel.
Actually, Bob, Destro, and I are moderating it together. We've worked together for a very long time, although we come from opposite sides of the country geographically. But we're looking forward to the exchange here. If you think about it, it's a little bit odd that we're, at the end of this 2 days, asking what is religious freedom and what it's not. But maybe we've had some additional thoughts. Actually, I think everyone here has a fairly good intuitive notion of what religious freedom is, and many of you have written extensively on this topic. But it is a useful time to be thinking about what religious freedom is or is not. Let's see, somewhere I'd written, a few years ago we organized a conference that was religious. It was religious freedom, but is it freedom of religion, for religion, from religion, or in religion? And you can think about that. And we actually published a book working through some of the odds and ends of that. But it may be a way to start thinking about things. Obviously, freedom of religion is freedom of religion or belief. FORB, as we say in international circles, is related to conscience. It's related to dignity. But what we want to do is talk a little bit more today about what it isn't and isn't. We have a distinguished group, but we decided in the spirit of letting people a maximum deference to every individual, we'll start with just brief statements about who we are and why we're here. And I'm the founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University, and I've worked on international religious freedom issues for a long time. Bob?
Thank you, Cole. And as Cole just said, if I had to attribute to anybody in particular introducing me to the concept of international religious freedom, it's Cole. I mean, I have been following Cole around for quite a long time. I'm Bob Destro. I teach at Catholic University Law School. I spent some time on our United States Civil Rights Commission. I was one of the few people at that time who was interested in freedom of religion and kind of how religion and ethnicity and culture fit together, which then brings you off into some very, very interesting areas. And I was honored to spend some time as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And we also got into these kinds of questions. And as Cole and I were sitting talking at lunch about how do you best, address this question, the one, is we'd like the members of the panel to talk about how they came here. Like, why is this panel an interesting thing for you? And from my perspective, people have asked me, well, now that you've spent some time inside the State Department, you see how the machine works, and one of the things that, any of us know is once that you've seen something, you can't unsee it, and so, people have said, well, what do you want to write about? And I said, well, what I'd kind of like to write about is putting the human back in human rights. And that the question of what is our common humanity, why does that bring us here? How is faith, how is religion part of that common human experience? And it's experienced differently in different places, to be sure, but one of the interesting things for me is as soon as I got to the State Department, I hadn't done much work with international organizations before. And one of the organizations with which we dealt with extensively was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. Now, Cole is a veteran of OSCE meetings. But one of the questions, one of the issues that they said, well, we're going to go to the HDIM meetings. And it's like, what is HDIM? Well, it's the human dimension. Okay, and so they say, well, what's the human dimension of religious liberty? What's the human dimension of something like, what does it mean to have a home? I mean, there's a human, what's the human dimension of human rights? That's kind of what brings me here. And so I'm now going to turn the microphone over to the Imam, and he can talk a little bit about what brings him here.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Always we begin with Almighty God's name, and we greet you all with the greetings of peace. I'm again Imam Talib Shareef of Masjid Muhammad the Nations Mosque, and we've been hearing since we've been here about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course the 75th year that we're in right now. Mosque that I'm in right now goes back to the 1930s, and it was established by descendants of those who were denied all of those rights, including freedom of religion. And after coming out of pre-existing buildings, the community built a building in D.C., and they dedicated it on the day that the United Nations issued that Universal Declaration. And that was to remind us that we are to be proponents of all of those rights, and particularly as a faith community, that being a big premier one. And of course, Islam in its history was denied, was oppressed also for freedom of religion. So that brought me to it. I spent a lot of time I did 30 years in the military, traveled around 113 different locations. I had experienced a lot of that. In fact, even in the service, I was the pioneer, one of those who helped set up the Islamic chaplaincy because we didn't have a lot of things to accommodate. And we had and it wasn't popular at that time when I joined, which was in the 70s. And so all of that propels me to be here, to be an advocate of this innate right that's a birthright for all of us. And of course, we know now that we all go back. The many faiths, they all mention that there has to be a first, and we all are connected with that life. So trying to get us to see who we are as human beings, if we better see who we are as human beings, then we can better respect each other, that we're really a part of each other. We talk about Adam, that's one name that's used, but there are other names that are used as well. But again, that's all of that brings me to where we are now. And I've done some things with the State Department, certainly been working with the Round Table, doing a lot of things with other international groups in this area as well. It's very important. If we can get this right, this first freedom, this first fundamental right, we can help bring about peace and global stability.
My name is Nick Fish, and I'm the president of American Atheists, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here to speak with you all and to share this great panel with such distinguished co-panelists. I've been asked a number of times throughout this weekend, as have my colleagues, like, what in the world are you doing here? Or maybe not verbally, but with the look when we introduce ourselves of say where we're from. And in fact, I want to get this right. Mark Kellner, who writes for the Washington Times, spoke with me yesterday, and he wrote a piece, and he said, it may seem as jarring as having a vegan address a cattlemen's convention. I promise I don't have any large hats or anything like that if I was speaking to a cattlemen's convention, so I'm maybe not quite as out of place. But the reason that it's important for us as atheists to be here is because the freedom of religion or belief applies to the freedom to believe or not believe, to live your conscience as a religious practitioner or to change your religious practice, to question orthodoxy. And the term atheist is often used as a weapon by repressive regimes that are seeking to enforce a particular doctrine and dogma on their people. And that often is the people who are often targeted with that label and subjected to blasphemy laws or branded apostates and thrown in jail, are often reformers, people who are seeking to elevate the human rights discussion in a broader context, to protect all of the human rights that we all share. And because they're challenging orthodoxy, because they're questioning the regime in some way, they're branded as atheists, and those blasphemy laws are used against them. And so this is all part of an important conversation, because we as atheists are the victims of discrimination and stigma and oppression and persecution in much the same way that religious minorities are in these nations. And so I strongly believe that our dignity as humans, our human rights, are all interconnected. That my right as an atheist to not be aligned with any one particular religion in a nation is jeopardized just as much as a religious minority, and in a nation where atheism is mandated by the government, that is not religious freedom either. And so when people see my presence or question our participation in this, I think it potentially speaks to a misunderstanding that I have hostility to religion or FORB, and to use that more inclusive term, that I have hostility in some way, and it couldn't be further from the truth, because any religion or any nation that can take away your right to practice your religion can also force a religion onto me. And we're all in this together. Every single person in this room, every group in this room, every denomination, every person on this stage, we're in this shared struggle together. And it's vital that we work to elevate FORB and elevate those universal human rights in that human rights framework. So thank you again for allowing me to be here and for the really great conversation.
Sorry. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate. My name is Hamza Yusuf, and I'm associated with the Forum for Promoting Peace, which was an initiative from my teacher, Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya, and the Alliance of Virtue, which is one of the sponsors here. I'm also the president of a small Muslim liberal arts college in what I call the ground zero for the dissolution of Western civilization, Berkeley, California. In any case, I think it's fascinating that probably most people in this room, if not all, have ancestors that were victims of some kind of persecution. My own great-grandfather, migrated to this country from Ireland and was, as a Catholic, was received in Philadelphia with the anti-Catholic riots in which they burnt down several Catholic churches. So religious freedom is obviously very important, but it's really a double entendre, because religion views freedom very differently from the modern liberal understanding of what freedom is. Religious freedom tends to be moral and intellectual freedom and spiritual freedom, as opposed to simply licentiousness or the freedom to do, as the Abbey of Thelema says, what thou wilt.
Well, thank you very much for this initial round of sort of introductions, getting a little bit of a feel for the panel. And what we would like to do now is just turn to the question for the session, and that is, what is religious freedom or what is it not? I think our sense, thinking about it before, is it might be more helpful to have people emphasize what it's not, although I don't want to necessarily tie people to that, but that may be the kind of the fruitful place to start the discussion as to what religious freedom is not. Let's see. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll let you go. We go. Okay.
Nick, you've got a microphone. Why don't you start?
Happy to. Sorry, hog the mic over here. I'll pass it over next. In thinking about this question of what religious freedom is or is not, the way that I always approach it is from a pluralistic standpoint, and the way that we kind of articulate this often is in the context of secularism. And when I say secularism, and what we mean by that in the atheist and humanist community, was, I think, most carefully articulated in 2017 in what we called the London Declaration on Secularism, that seeks to push back this idea that secularism entails in some way a dominance of non-religious lifestyles over religious lifestyles, but rather is standing up for a pluralistic, inclusive vision of freedom of religion and belief. So a secular state that recognizes that people can hold all sorts of different religious beliefs or no religious beliefs at all, and that public institutions and public services that are shared amongst all the people need to maintain that neutrality. And it also doesn't mean that our ability to manifest our beliefs is unchecked or absolute, that when we live in a society, when we operate in shared spaces, that it's important for us to recognize that we share that same space, that we occupy those same social structures, that we occupy civic life together. And so I'm always a little hesitant to concede in some way that FORB, or the freedom of religion, to use the less inclusive term, is in some way a super right or a trump card that can be played on top of the broader panoply of human rights, that they all exist intertwined and interconnected together, and that when we start allowing religious freedom to trump all of the other rights that are articulated in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights or in other legal structures, that what we end up with is the denial of services, the denial of people's shared humanity, the denial of equal access to society and civic structures. And so that's an important part of this. But from a top level, 30,000 foot view, that freedom of expression, the freedom to express one's views, to live out those views, we're all on the same page with that. Because we face the same challenges and the same discrimination. So that's kind of one pushback that I might have from some of the conversation we've had that I've heard throughout this summit, is just the cautioning about creating religious freedom as the baseline, the top human right in some way, that it's part of the broader network of human rights.
Okay. In Islam, the word for religion that's translated to be religion is deen. And so we accept the translation, but it's broader than that. It really means a way of life. And so in understanding that, it really incorporates those who has a way of life that may be different in their belief or not belief. And so there's a verse where Prophet Muhammad is given to let people know they can be the way they are, and they have the freedom to do that. To you be your way, to me be mine, and we don't have the right to infringe on how we believe and to push my belief on you, you to push yours on me. When we look at the first Islamic society, there were those, and we're talking about Medina now. It was called Yathrib. But it became to be called Medina. Those who don't know, Medina actually comes from the word Medina, which means that it's a place where you be civil, where you teach you how to be civil and how to interact with each other. So that's why it became to be called, when Prophet Muhammad got there, he renamed it to Medina. And we use it as a common word now, the city, because cities are a place where we expect people to have civilization going on, people to be civil. But so in that society, they had 12 tribes. They weren't all on the same page. They had different religions. They had Jews, they had Christians, they had others, they had non-believers, they had pagans there. Some people only believe, it's hard to believe there were pagans that were there. He had to fight against pagans, but there were pagans in that society. But they had hundreds of years of disputes. And so when they found out about Prophet Muhammad, the tribes went to Mecca to visit him to see if he can come help them solve these issues. And a lot of those issues have a lot to do with what we see today. People wanted to say theirs to subjugate their way to others. Anyway, so they all accepted him to have this one arbitrator to come be the leader of the society. And of course, when he came there, he instituted this constitution, which is a very pivotal part and is a partnership with this international religious freedom today with the Alliance of Virtue, the Forum for Peace. Here in America, Imam W.D. Muhammad in the 70s was studying Medina, and he began to have us begin to work and see things differently with faith and those who didn't believe in relationships. But Sheikh bin Bayah, his insights were able to now to see that as a big player with Muslims right now being about 1 billion point something in the world, to get them to look at that document. And then, of course, he drew from that document because it has a success. We're speaking about success now because in his society, there are about 50 articles in this initial what we call Medina Constitution. It can be called Charter and different things, but there are about 50 things, and it really everything in the America's Constitution pretty much is in that document. But there are some things that Medina Constitution address where America doesn't in terms of helping the oppressed in certain ways. But we don't have time to go through all of those. But if we look at all of those, we can see how that really kind of defines what we're speaking about now, what is and what isn't, and how to respect those who don't believe the way you believe. And then the whole thing is, in order to have a society that really shows it respect and see everybody, we all have regardless what we believe, we didn't create ourselves. None of us created ourselves. Okay, so we are part of creation, so there has to be a creator. So whether we want to identify that, that's the reality there. So he established a society that saw everybody and wanted to treat everybody as the creation of a superior authority. And so he did that. There's an author named Rose Wilder Lang, and I'll finish on this note. And because she's the daughter of Laura Ingrall, who did The Little House on the Prairie. And so she did a book called, I think it was Search of Democracy, something along those lines. And in her search, she was looking to see what were the models. And so she found 3 in human history. And of course, 2 of them are much older, and of course, 1 of them are very close to us. And the first model she saw was the society established by Abraham, and we call him Ibrahim. We say peace be upon him. Now, in that society, because our Quran lets us know that there were those that didn't believe the way Abraham did. Plus, there were those who today are classified maybe as homosexuals. And they had rights. He didn't seek to hurt them, because we all know that Abraham had some visitors and they came up to him, but he didn't. There's nowhere in that society where he told them that is something that was not to be in the society. You know, he just appealed to their reasoning, their logic. But that was something that was in the society of Abraham. And she said in that society, that with the other faiths and those who didn't believe in the pagans, that he created something where everybody would be responsible for a superior authority over them. And it was basically saying that one of the problems that we have in society is that nobody wants an authority over them. And when we begin to see things like that, then that's when we begin to have problems. The second one was this Prophet Muhammad, the Medina model. And then the last one was, she said, and she looked at history coming from that, she said, was America. And she didn't hesitate to say that America drew from the first 2 to establish its society. And, of course, we found a lot of parallels, as I mentioned, about that document, the Constitution of Medina.
Hamza? Go ahead. No, you go ahead. Yep.
All right. Bismillah. So I think one of the biggest problems that we're facing is we've been a transitional generation. So those of us who are older, at least, we've seen just such major shifts in our culture. And one of the biggest shifts is this movement away from traditional religion as it's understood. All of the traditional religions, I think, feel under siege right now, because many of the things that they hold dear, like Abrahamic morality, for instance, are now seen as a kind of bigoted view of the world. It's interesting that bigot comes from by God, the word in its etymological derivation. So the bigots were those who were constantly appealing to God. So I think that one of the things that our civilization now views is that somehow religion was the scaffolding by which we built our civilization. But those of us who actually still believe feel that it's the foundation of the civilization, and we can't simply just remove the scaffolding of religion and there's anything going to be left. I mean, this is something that Kierkegaard already saw early on, the leveling of modern society. I mean, it's very interesting that hierarchy itself is a Greek word which means the rule of the sacred, that if families are based on hierarchy, if there's not parental authority, there is no family. And yet we're living in a time where all hierarchy is seen now as some kind of evil that needs to be eradicated. And so I think for those of us that do believe in religion itself, religious freedom is something that we understand to be much deeper than simply the freedom to practice our religion, but actually the freedom to flourish as human beings and in societies that are becoming increasingly antithetical to religion. I mean, secularism is a fine and dandy word, but a lot of people fail to recognize that secularism is actually a Christian heresy. I mean, the people that gave us these fine ideals of secularism were deeply informed by Christian sentiments, by Christian sensibilities. Hume and Locke, Montesquieu, all of these people, they came out of deeply religious civilizations. And so secularism and laicism, which is increasingly becoming the phenomenon in America, this idea that we have to remove religion entirely, which was never the original intent of the people that founded this country. They understood that religion was absolutely essential. And if you read their writings, it's very clear to them that they did not see a republic even possible without religious sentiment and belief. So I think we're seeing the results of a society that is anti-religious out there. We're seeing the breakdown of authority. We're seeing all of these things that are happening. We're watching them before our eyes. I mean, civilizations do collapse. And I think we're all on the Titanic right now, and it's the unsinkable ship in the minds of a lot of people, but it did sink. And California, which was the ship that saved them, is not going to save us.
In giving some thought to the question of what is it not, certainly there's very little to disagree with what my colleagues have said. But one thing is true is that religion itself is often the glue that holds a community together. And it could be an atheist community. So I mean, I've heard you speak, and the same thing is like we're a community, and so the community is defined, sometimes by family, by culture, by language, and certainly by faith or even lack of. And so this question about who's a member of the community then becomes a very important one. And so when I said, what's the human dimension of this? I mean, none of us would be here but for a community. And this question of then where is the dividing line between what Nick mentioned was public space and what's private space? And we heard one of our colleagues at lunch today talking about how an American general said, well, yeah, we're okay with freedom of religion as long as you go in your house and lock the door. That the question is, and I always in these settings, it's like, wait a minute, if we're really equal, doesn't that mean that what you believe is interesting to me, we can discuss it, but I kind of have to take you as I find you. And the fact that I don't like it is kind of irrelevant. And more importantly, back in the times when you look at the persecution of the early Christians, they weren't persecuted because they were Christians. They were persecuted because they were atheos. They were without God. They were without the gods of the community. And the question of what are the gods of today's community is a debatable question. I mean, that is where we see it's like, well, look, it's just a little piece of pork, or it's just a little piece of incense. You have to bow down to my idol, or you're not a member of the community. That's where the dividing line, it seems to me, is. And the fact that you have to take me as you find me, because otherwise I'll start to ask the question, who died and left you in charge?
Well, let's see. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. I mean, I think one of the questions here, the theme of secularism, has been talked about in a couple of contexts, and sometimes one picture of freedom of religion or belief is the freedom from religion. So in some ways equated with the secular, and be interested to how. You talked about a 2017 definition of secularism. One can think of secularism. I mean, if you read the literature on secularism, it's huge. So it's kind of vast. But the point is how that notion connects with or is different from freedom of religion or belief. And maybe I'll let you start.
I won't pretend that there's one authoritative definition. I mean, that's sort of a limitation, perhaps, is that there isn't a book of how to do this. And so a lot of what we talk about is the byproduct of years, decades, hundreds of years of philosophy and debate and discourse, looking into how to order what we mean by secularism, what we mean by protecting freedom of religion or belief. And I wanted to, address one thing that Bob said that I think is important is I'm certainly not in favor, and I don't think most atheists or humanists would believe that, or would favor an idea that there is no religion in public space, that public spaces are shared public spaces, that we can talk about our shared values, and part of our shared values are a commitment to being able to talk about our beliefs, being able to engage in robust discourse and push back and have that way of discussing our rights and the way of discussing politics that includes a whole range of sources of inspiration, of sources of rights and all that. But one of the problems is that when religion, especially political religion, nations that are built around the elevation and the privileging of one particular religious belief over all others, is that discourse mechanism, that ability to challenge orthodoxy, the ability to reform religions, rapidly breaks down. That religion, any particular religion, regardless of how we like to conceive of it, is not static. That beliefs, that interpretations change over time, and that's just sort of the nature of things, and that the heresy of today is often the orthodoxy of tomorrow. That different interpretations of our religions end up becoming the defaults or the baseline 20, 50, 100 years from now. It doesn't always require the nailing of any treatises to doors. That sometimes it's a slow evolutionary process hashed out in public forums and debates and discourse. And so we see over and over again that in regimes that silence and push out that dissent, that they are less free than the nations where there is a separation of church and state, to use maybe a phrase that has additional meaning here, but where there are nations where there is that respect for pluralism, that they are societies that tend to flourish. That in fact it's coercive, domineering religion that contributes to human suffering, and that pluralism, that respect for each other's our shared humanity, our shared human rights, is a core part of FORB, and a necessary precondition for flourishing and for strong societies. So I think that's more how I think about it.
Well, in response to that, I mean, first of all, these are words that we're using that, I mean, what does flourishing mean? Does it mean economic flourishing? Are we talking about just human happiness? Because I would argue that some of the countries in the world which I've lived in that are very poor countries that are certainly not flourishing economically, but I tended to found the actual psychological states of the people much better than most of the psychological states of our people here in this country. The children, our children are suffering grossly. I mean, I don't know if you're following all the mental health issues that are afflicting our society, the numbers of people that are on anxiolytic drugs. I mean, I don't know. So what do we call flourishing? And I would argue that eudaimonia, this idea of flourishing, has to do with the development of the soul. I mean, even the Greeks with their paganism understood that. And how does the soul develop? How do we develop a human soul? Because the mechanisms traditionally that we have to do that are within our religious apparatus. We don't really have secular mechanisms for developing the soul other than a kind of, the wine, cheese, and cracker crowd that can talk about Jane Austen. But the reality of it is all of the great works that they talk about came out of deeply religious societies. And I think it's very interesting that we don't have culture. If you want to call Hollywood culture, if you want to call, when have we had a truly great poet? In our society, because these things come out of religious sentiment. The religion has inspired the greatest works of architect, the greatest works of art, the greatest works of literature. This is where it comes from. Without it, we are a nihilistic, bestial, commodified human being that's left simply like the jellyfish to be a spineless consumer. And this is what's happening in our culture. And if people can't see that, I think they're blind. But it's interesting in our religious traditions, we talk about the blind, right? So.
My wife asked me before I left, it really had nothing to do with this, but she just was asked a question. She said, that movie that Denzel was in, she said, why did they do that? The Book of Eli is what she was talking about. And so I had to let them know. I said, well, you see, at the end, they were trying to get the religions, to pull the religions back together, because when they pulled that out, that's when the society began to become chaotic. And what I have friends and people that I know who consider themselves atheists. I don't know if this is the case for Dean, but they say it's not necessarily they don't believe. They really just don't like the way structured religion is. It has kind of turned them off. That has become the case for some of them, because in a state of nature, every one of us, there's something that's driving us, and that's what we have to be free to be able to explore that because of the gifts that we have that are in us. You come here. If we just say Adam, for instance, when Adam was created, okay, he didn't have the identities that we have now. We got national identities, we got ethnic identities, we got racial identities, because those identities didn't exist. And if we look at things in a state of nature in terms of how natural development is, we need to start looking back at our children in a state of nature. When they come here, they're not conscious of themselves as a race. They're not conscious of themselves as a nationality, ethnicity. All that comes later, you see. And at some point, we go from physical, mental, spiritual. But we're spiritual. We say that the soul is a gift to the body. But the body, the physical body, is where we get our first help from, because that is completely obedient to a natural order. I used to work for the Office of Special Investigation, OSI, Office of Special Investigation, when I was in the Air Force. And every day I would go to work, they would have a slogan that you'd be confronted with when you come in the forum that says, "In God we trust, all others we polygraph." Okay? And so they show us the scientific mind studies the body, and the body, really don't want the mind going against certain things. And so they learned to put it up against machines, but we can go against that body. Okay, but then the mind turns on, and later it come into the spiritual side. We are more spiritual than physical, We're invisible and we're invisible. So my invisible is influencing my visible now, and so we have to allow people to explore the invisible, because that's really what's been the establishment and causes manifestation of the physical that we're benefiting from now.
I had heard a slightly different rendition of that, which is, "In God we trust, all others pay cash." So, Cole, why don't you go ahead?
So I just had the experience last week of reading a doctoral thesis that was written about the sort of three prominent secular societies, France, Italy, and Turkey. And it was quite interesting because the idea of the thesis writer was to trace the notion of constitutional secularism, and she was worried at various points that it was really getting thinned out. And the proof was that in place after place, she could see compromises that were being made with religion. That is, even in secular France, you have some support for religious education and some payments even into private schools. In Italy, the notion of laicite is almost the opposite of laicite in France because it's a much more friendly notion of secularism. Turkey, of course, is its own interesting ultimate case of secularism until Erdogan. The story there is that secularism was really an excuse for absolute control of the state, of religion, but it was running religion through the Diyanet. And when the political Islam came to power, they could just use the mechanism and sort of impose religious kind of notions. Now, what was interesting to me is what she saw in these three countries, and I would say we see it also in the United States, by the way, is a tendency, sort of a convergence, a recognition in various ways that there's room for religion and partnership with religion in the secular space. One has to think carefully about it. We have an establishment clause. I mean, I think a number of people are sort of alarmed by the fact that recently a lot of things that end up allowing some state funds to go over to religious education and so forth, because otherwise the religious groups are being sort of discriminated against. But this is a shift, a significant shift from the 1970s, for example. And as I read the thesis, I found myself saying, wait a minute, was secularism really ever as absolute as her model seemed to presuppose? And isn't this drift toward greater accommodation something that is really reflective of religious liberty? Now, of course, everyone is trying to capture these concepts like religious liberty, like dignity, etc. But isn't it? I mean, what does religious liberty require? I mean, how much partnership between religion and public authorities is legitimate? When is it good? When is it a problem?
Yeah, that's if I can add to that, that's why I really have come to look at this human dimension question. You know, when Imam was saying that looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, during my time in the State Department, we had a big discussion. Secretary Pompeo put together a commission on inalienable rights, and the discussion was really pretty interesting. And I was privileged as the assistant secretary to talk to them at their initial lunch. And I said, the first thing you got to do is get the disagreements on the table. It's like, enough of this, the minimal statement you can agree on to get a consensus. It's far better to understand where everybody's coming from and where they literally cannot handle the other side. And so if you start with the human piece, there's not only, one of the problems I think we have here in the United States and in the West generally is this idea of individualism. That religion is an individual experience. And as the late Justice John Paul Stevens said, he says, well, basically, and I'm paraphrasing for sure, that basically any religion worth its salt is chosen. Well, excuse me, but at least from the perspective of Islam and Judaism, it's not chosen; it's submitted. I mean, to the Jewish community, they were chosen. Passive voice. The submission. And so when you start from the proposition of that integral human relationship, I loved what you were talking about, the soul and the body. And so when the body and the soul come together, certainly in most religious traditions, is inside your mother, right? And that then the formation of the child physically and emotionally and morally is in that parent-child family relationship. And if you look at what's being fought over today, almost invariably it's who's in control of that. So, Cole, I'm going to go back to you.
And part of it are these deep philosophical problems of, what is nature? What is human nature? Science has become the arbiter of these things. And then on the other hand, you have a type of wokeness that rejects science altogether very often when it suits them and uses it when it suits them. So I think, the religious traditions are handicapped right now because of these dominant arbiters in our culture. And that's why I think religious freedom is such a major concern. I mean, it's very odd that in the United States, when it's enshrined in the First Amendment, that we have freedom of religion, that it's such a big concern amongst the religious communities in the United States right now because 501c3s are being threatened. I mean, we've had in California attempts at legislation to remove the 501c3 status for groups that don't have, for instance, LGBT-friendly campuses and things like this. So there are a lot of issues, and this is, I think, increasingly going to be a battle, really. And the lines will be drawn. And I think traditional religious peoples that actually believe in traditional religion as it's revealed to those of us who actually believe in divine revelation, we have to stand by it. I don't want to see violence, certainly. I want to see persuasion, but I also want to see some recognition on behalf of people. There's almost a type of vengeance in certain groups that have traditionally been persecuted by religion that are now kind of, it's our turn to persecute you. And two wrongs don't make a right.
One thing that may be just worth asking is whether religious freedom is merely an individual right, or is it something more than that? That is, to what extent should religious communities be able to sort of be protected in their structures and so forth?
Well, I'm conscious of the fact that we only have about 5 minutes left, so I'll be very brief. The freedom of religion or belief includes the ability to gather in community with co-religionists to talk about your religion. That's a core part of it. I do think it's important, though, to acknowledge that it's a human right, that freedom of religion and belief is a human right that protects human beings and not the ideas or the belief systems themselves. And that's an issue when going back into the international context, when we try to project that human right onto the belief itself or onto the institution, what you end up with are blasphemy laws, or you end up with public order laws that by criticizing this religion, by going out there and trying to upset the orthodoxy, what you're doing is you're contributing to the decline of society. This is exactly what my colleague, the president of the Nigerian Humanist Association, was arrested for was going out, and he posted on his Facebook page, and he said, "This is the one life we have to live. That's it." And he was directed to be arrested in a different province in Nigeria by the Kano state. He was arrested in a completely different state, extradited to Kano, spent a year in jail without any charges being filed. The federal court said, "This is against our Constitution. This is an illegal detention." They finally charged him. He has now spent 1,008 days in detention and was sentenced to more than 25 years in jail for public order issues. And so this is why this issue matters so much to me personally, to us as a community, and why I do think it's so important to have these conversations around what exactly are the contours of this, and to be very careful about what we start talking about of, your questioning of religion, your lack of religious belief is destroying society in some way, because that's used by repressive regimes to silence people who are questioning the orthodoxy, even within the context of a religious belief. That even by attacking non-believers, we are again that invective is hurled at people who are reformers as well. That you are not a true believer. That you must be trying to destroy this. And so I just want to urge that caution, and again mention that we have 2 minutes left now. So I went longer than I wanted to, and I apologize.
Yeah, nobody comes here in a vacuum. We are connected to life, so human beings' life is in a social setting. So that takes it to the community. So individual and community, so we have to protect these communities as well.
To end, for me, it seems that the formulations of religious freedom ought to be guided by the need for a new cultural consensus. I believe in natural law as broadly conceived, and that project is inevitably going to have severe backlash from existing institutions that are privileged over a lot of the religious institutions, and even from the existing international initiatives for religious freedom. So the restoration and centrality of a sound epistemology and metaphysical approach to reality that recognizes the laws of nature imposed upon us by design, that sanity has a chance of being restored. It means a radical departure from the current anti-culture and miseducation that defines our so-called civilization, a sound return to enlightened religious principles with their concomitant emphasis on moral and intellectual freedom, I think can help restore a profoundly sick community.
Thank you very much. I think that was wonderful. I just think we've learned some things that one of the things that freedom of religion is not is a mask to cover bigotry. It is clearly something that's pluralistic and not just a particular brand of secularism. It's something that leaves open a real framework for us to live together. And it's one of the things, in my view, it's one of the great keys, the great modern keys of how to live together with deep difference in peaceful ways. And it protects the non-believers, it protects the believers, it protects the minority religions, it protects threatened majorities as well. And we're very fortunate to have that.
Okay, and then just to finish up, I'll just say at the end, I'm about to give a paper on all this on Friday. And one of the things that we have to understand that in a pluralistic society, or even in one that's not so pluralistic, the fact that I believe differently does not mean that I have a right to claim psychic injury if I happen to watch you praying, or if you happen to do something that I disagree with, then, and we used to call that, Justice O'Connor used to call it the objective observer. And of course it was a very convoluted definition, but now it's kind of morphed into what we call the offended observer. So I can take offense, and so I get to shut you down. And that's what we see in cancel culture today. And so with that, I think we're going to thank you all for your presence. Thank you for your for your moderation and giving us the high sign to shut up when it was time to shut up. And thank you all for coming. We're glad you made it.